Every presidency is defined by a handful of decisions that reveal whether power is being exercised with discipline or gambled on instinct. In this case, the trajectory shifted not because of a single scandal or opponent, but because of a choice that transformed manageable risk into a structural threat. What made this decision fatal was not merely its content, but its timing, its context, and the assumption behind it that personal will could override institutional gravity. The decision emerged at a moment when political margins were already narrow. Legal exposure was mounting, electoral coalitions were fragile, and public tolerance for disruption had thinned. Instead of consolidating ground, the move widened the battlefield. It forced institutions, courts, bureaucracies, donors, and even reluctant allies to stop hedging and start responding. In strategic terms, it turned latent friction into open resistance. What is often misunderstood is that power in a modern presidency is less about command than alignment. Presidents do not rule alone. They operate inside systems that reward predictability and punish volatility. The decision in question ignored this reality. It treated institutional constraints as obstacles to be bulldozed rather than terrain to be navigated. That misreading mattered more than ideology. Systems can absorb controversial policy. They rarely forgive perceived defiance of the process itself. Once the decision was made, reversal became impossible. Even attempts to soften or reframe it only confirmed the underlying weakness. Opponents no longer needed to speculate about intent. They could point to consequence. Allies were forced to distance themselves, not out of principle, but out of survival. The political cost stopped being theoretical and became cumulative. Strategically, this was the moment when optionality disappeared. Before, there were exits, compromises, and delays. Afterward, every path narrowed. The presidency was no longer managing risk, it was reacting to it. And reaction in politics, as in conflict, always favors the side that did not make the first mistake. This is how trajectories change, not with noise, but with a single decision that exposes a leader's misunderstanding of where power truly resides. Power is often mistaken for freedom of action. In reality, it is a balance between authority and limitation, between what one wants to do and what the system will allow without resistance. The fatal error in this phase was not overreach alone, but a fundamental misreading of where power actually resides in a modern political order. The presidency was treated as a personal instrument when in fact it is a negotiated position embedded in law, norms, and institutional memory. The assumption appeared to be that loyalty could substitute for legitimacy and confrontation could replace consent. That is a dangerous illusion. Institutions do not respond to personality. They respond to incentives, procedures, and precedent. Courts do not bend because a leader is popular. Bureaucracies do not comply because rhetoric is loud. When those realities are ignored, the system does not collapse, it hardens. What followed was predictable. Legal mechanisms that might have remained dormant were activated. Administrative processes, once flexible, became rigid. Actors who had tolerated ambiguity were forced to choose sides, not ideologically, but operationally. The mistake was believing that pressure would intimidate the system into compliance. Instead, it unified disparate parts of it around self-preservation. This is where constraint becomes visible. Constraints are not weaknesses, they are stabilizers. A skilled leader works within them, exploiting space without challenging the framework itself. Here, the framework was challenged directly. The result was not liberation, but isolation. Each attempt to assert dominance reduced room to maneuver. Each public escalation closed a private door. There is also a strategic irony at work. By framing opposition as conspiratorial or illegitimate, the presidency unintentionally elevated institutional actors into guardians of order. Resistance became duty, process became shield. What might have been contested politically was instead resolved procedurally, and procedure favors patience over impulse. Misreading constraints leads leaders to fight the wrong battles. Instead of shaping outcomes, they end up proving limits. At that point, the struggle is no longer about winning, but about enduring. And endurance is not a position of strength for a presidency that depends on momentum, credibility, and coalition. This was the moment when power stopped expanding and began contracting, not because it was taken away, but because it was misunderstood. Strategy is patience applied to power. It is the discipline of choosing not only what to do, but what not to do, and when to do nothing at all. In this phase, that discipline gave way to instinct. Decisions were no longer sequenced toward an end state. They were reaction driven by emotion, grievance, and the belief that speed could compensate for planning. That shift mattered more than any individual choice, because once instinct replaces strategy, coherence collapses. Instinct feels decisive. It creates the illusion of strength because it moves fast and speaks loudly. But speed without direction is not momentum, it is exposure. Each response became narrower, more personal, more confrontational. Instead of shaping the environment, the presidency allowed itself to be shaped by it. Opponents began setting the tempo. Institutions dictated the calendar. The initiative quietly slipped away. The strategist understands that every move creates second and third order effects. Instinct ignores those layers. What mattered in the moment became more important than what followed. Legal pressure was answered with rhetorical escalation. Political setbacks were met with loyalty tests. Criticism triggered retaliation rather than recalibration. These reactions may have energized a base, but they eroded the broader coalition required to govern or survive prolonged conflict. There is a cost to governing by instinct that is often invisible at first. Advisors stop advising and start filtering. Information becomes curated to avoid confrontation. Decision makers hear affirmation instead of assessment. In military terms, this is how command blindness forms, not because intelligence is absent, but because it is unwelcome. The presidency began operating inside an echo chamber, mistaking agreement for accuracy. Meanwhile, adversaries adapted. They did not need to outmaneuver a strategy. They only needed to wait for the next impulse. Each instinctive move could be anticipated, prepared for, and absorbed. Over time, reaction replaced initiative entirely. The presidency no longer dictated terms, it responded to them. This is the quiet danger of instinct-driven leadership. It feels powerful in the moment, but it steadily hands control to others. Strategy constrains emotion to preserve freedom of action. Instinct does the opposite. By this stage, the path forward was no longer chosen. It was improvised, and improvisation under pressure rarely favors the one already losing leverage. Institutions do not strike back out of anger. They respond when survival, legitimacy, or precedent is threatened. What followed was not a coordinated conspiracy, but something far more durable, a system reverting to self-defense. Once instinct-driven leadership began colliding with legal process and administrative norms, the response became automatic. Procedure replaced discretion. Rules were enforced not flexibly, but precisely. This is how institutional power actually manifests. It does not announce itself. It does not posture. It moves through filings, rulings, deadlines, compliance reviews, and jurisdictional authority. Each action on its own appeared narrow and technical. Together, they formed a lattice that constrained movement in every direction. The presidency was not attacked head-on. It was surrounded. The critical mistake was assuming these actions were political rather than structural. That misdiagnosis led to the wrong countermeasures. Rhetoric was aimed at individuals when the pressure was coming from the process. Loyalty was demanded from actors bound by oath and law. Public confrontation was chosen against institutions that operate most effectively in silence. Each escalation only justified further tightening. What made the counterstrike effective was patience. Institutions can afford time. They do not face elections. They do not rely on rallies or narratives. Their power grows as others exhaust themselves. While the presidency burned energy responding to each new development, the system advanced incrementally, methodically, without deviation. This asymmetry is decisive. One side must constantly perform. The other only has to persist. As the counterstrike matured, space disappeared. Options that once existed, negotiation, de-escalation, compartmentalization, were foreclosed by prior decisions. Even sympathetic actors were constrained. Support could no longer be given quietly. Neutrality became impossible. The environment hardened into one where every action carried consequences and inaction carried risk. At this stage, Outcomes no longer depended on persuasion. They depended on procedure, and procedure favors those who respect it, understand it, and wait. The presidency had done none of those things. What remained was a contest between urgency and endurance. History is unkind to leaders who confuse noise for leverage in that kind of fight. The counterstrike did not seek victory. It sought compliance. And once that dynamic is established, power shifts permanently, not with spectacle, but with finality. Narratives are only powerful as long as they align with observable reality. Once facts, documents, and timelines begin to contradict the story being told, the narrative ceases to persuade and instead becomes a liability. This was the point where messaging stopped shaping perception and began exposing vulnerability. The collapse did not happen all at once. It happened through accumulation, through details that refused to stay buried. At first, the narrative still functioned within a loyal audience. The language of victimhood, persecution, and defiance resonated emotionally. But institutions do not operate on emotion, and neither do records. As proceedings advanced, the story was forced to coexist with transcripts, filings, sworn testimony, and procedural outcomes. These are unforgiving forms of truth. They do not debate, they document. The problem was not that the narrative was aggressive, it was static. Strategy requires narratives to adapt as conditions change. Instead, repetition replaced evolution. Each new development was framed the same way as the last, even as circumstances shifted. What initially sounded like conviction began to sound like denial. Observers outside the core base noticed the disconnect. So did allies who depended on plausibility to justify support. There is a strategic danger in overusing narrative as a substitute for control. When rhetoric escalates faster than reality, credibility erodes. Every unfulfilled claim, every promised reversal that does not materialize weakens the storyteller. Eventually, even supporters recalibrate, not because they abandon belief, but because they begin hedging against outcomes the narrative insists are impossible. Media dynamics accelerated the collapse, but they did not cause it. The cause was structural exposure. Once the presidency was forced into reactive messaging, it lost the ability to set frames. It could respond, deny, and accuse, but it could no longer define terms. The story became fragmented, defensive, and increasingly disconnected from consequence. This is the moment when narratives stop mobilizing and start exhausting. They demand constant reinforcement. They require louder repetition to maintain the same effect. Meanwhile, reality continues forward, indifferent to belief. The gap widens until even sympathetic audiences sense it. When narrative collapses, power follows, not because stories are everything, but because without them, authority must rest solely on results. And by this stage, results were no longer controllable, only endured. By the time consequences fully surfaced, containment was no longer possible. What had once been a series of manageable risks converged into a single self-reinforcing crisis. Legal exposure, political isolation, financial strain, and institutional resistance stopped operating as separate pressures and began amplifying one another. At that point, no single decision could reverse the momentum. The system had already shifted into resolution mode. This is where many leaders misunderstand consequences. They assume damage is linear, that one setback produces one response, one loss, one recovery. In reality, consequences compound. Legal proceedings generate political fallout. Political fallout weakens donor confidence. Weakened confidence reduces organizational discipline. Each effect accelerates the next. The presidency was no longer facing a challenge. It was navigating a cascade. Attempts to contain the damage only revealed how little control remained. Strategic silence was no longer available because absence was interpreted as a concession. Escalation was equally costly because each new assertion invited verification, rebuttal, or procedural response. Even neutral actions were reframed through suspicion. This is what strategic exhaustion looks like, when every move consumes more capital than it generates. The most telling consequence was not external, but internal. Decision-making narrowed. Options were evaluated not on long-term viability, but on short-term survival. This is a dangerous shift. When survival replaces strategy, Leaders begin accepting outcomes they once would have rejected as unthinkable. Red lines blur, norms erode. The presidency began reacting not to shape the future, but to delay the inevitable. Support structures also began to fracture. Advisors, allies, and institutions operate on the confidence that leadership can manage consequences. Once that confidence disappears, loyalty becomes conditional and risk averse. Distance replaces alignment. Silence replaces advocacy. What remains is a shrinking circle that confuses proximity with strength. At this stage, the crisis no longer belonged to any single actor. It had escaped control. Outcomes would now be determined by timelines, procedures, and external judgment. The presidency had become subject to events rather than master of them. This is the price of ignoring limits. Consequences do not negotiate. They arrive when conditions are met, not when leaders are ready. Power is not proven by how loudly it is asserted, but by how carefully it is exercised. The final lesson in this trajectory is not ideological, partisan, or even personal. It is structural. It is the lesson that power, when detached from reality, turns inward and begins to consume the very authority it depends on to survive. This presidency did not fail because of enemies. It faltered because it treated limits as insults rather than signals. Modern power operates within systems designed to endure individuals. Leaders pass through them, institutions remain. When a leader believes the system will bend indefinitely, every constraint is misread as sabotage. In truth, constraints are the language of durability. They exist to prevent collapse, not to provoke it. Ignoring that reality does not expose weakness in the system, it exposes misunderstanding in the leader. What ultimately sealed the outcome was the refusal to adapt. Adaptation is not surrender, it is intelligence applied under pressure. The failure here was the insistence that willpower could substitute for alignment and that confrontation could replace legitimacy. History shows this mistake repeatedly across empires and eras. Those who confuse dominance with durability always reach the same point, a moment when power still looks formidable, but no longer functions. There is also a quieter lesson, often overlooked. Political systems do not require heroes or villains to correct course. They rely on process. When the process is respected, it absorbs error. When it is attacked, it responds defensively. This case reaffirmed that truth. The system did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be patient. In the end, the presidency was not undone by a single act, but by a pattern, a steady rejection of strategic humility. Power demands restraint because restraint preserves freedom of action. Without it, choices narrow, allies fade, and outcomes harden. What remains is consequence, delivered without drama. This is how power is lost in the modern age, not with a coup or a collapse, but with the slow realization that authority still exists on paper while control has already passed elsewhere.